Welcome back to Dist Media, a startup story. My name is Ben Olmos, founder and CEO of Dist Media. This is a podcast where I take you along my journey of starting Dist Media from the ground up. If this is your first time listening to the show, welcome. I'm happy you found us, and hopefully you'll like what you hear. For those of you coming back, I'm glad that we piqued your interest enough for you to return, and I hope that you enjoy this next step in our journey. This show is all about documenting Dist Media's startup journey and keeping you in the loop every step of the way. I'll be keeping you up to date on meetings, phone calls, emails, and all the things that I need to do to get this business up and running. So with that, let's pick up where we left off last time. Welcome back, everybody, to Dist Media, a startup story. I am your host, Ben Olmos, and joining me once again, my partner in crime, Alan. How are you doing?
Doing wonderful and really excited to have our first guest podcast.
Yeah.
This is awesome.
This is going to be great. And Keith is joining us as well, our board member extraordinaire. Keith,
Doing
how are
good.
you doing?
Doing very good so far.
All right. And joining us this episode, our special guest, John Pabon. John, how are you?
I'm doing well. Really looking forward to this.
Awesome. Well, John, one of the reasons so we got to tell this story of how all of this came about, because it's kind of weird. It's one of these ways that social media works. And I really want people to kind of understand kind of the power of this stuff. So sitting in my living room, scrolling through TikTok, and you come up with a video talking about greenwashing and, specifically talking about a case in Ecuador. I hate that I am forgetting the gentleman's name. He is a lawyer, environmental lawyer. And you were speaking to the fact that this case that has happened over the last 20 years involving Chevron, was it Texaco?
That's right.
Yeah. So I saw this video, loved the content, started scrolling through more of your stuff. And I said, hey, you've got this book coming out called Greenwashing. Very interesting topic. Would you mind if I do an article on you and your book? And you were gracious enough to accept. And so the power of DMs and reaching out and, connecting with people, that's kind of how we started talking. And fast forward to this moment. Now we're sitting down and we're going to talk about your book. So before we get into all of that, though, John, why don't you give us a little bit of background about what brought you to TikTok and all of the things that you're putting in there?
I'm a late TikTok adopter. I think I even adopted it post dancing. So I've never done any dancing on it. But I realized, early on, it's a great place to really communicate with people in sort of long form, which social media doesn't really have. You can kind of do LinkedIn, but that's text and nobody wants to read a long article on LinkedIn. But you can actually talk to people, you can engage. There's plenty of functionality around doing lives and things like that I thought, okay, for such a nuanced topic like sustainability or greenwashing or whatever it might be, that you need those longer conversations, because it's not as easy as just putting out a 30-second video and expecting people to understand and get what you're talking about. So that's what really drew me to TikTok. And then through a little bit of, I don't know, random luck, the videos started to get a bit of traction and the algorithm seemed to like me, and we love to be on the right side of the algorithm. So that got me a few followers, and it went from there. It's really been a great platform. I've been on a little over a year and a half-ish now, but a great way to engage and to really get to the heart of what I'm trying to talk about and to explain things in a way that sometimes takes 10 minutes, 15 minutes in a video, which TikTok allows for, which I think is it's totally great thing. And to really get feedback from folks as well, and to allow them to say, hey, I don't understand this topic. Could you tell me more about it in a video or whatever it might be? So it's been a great platform. And I know there's a lot of people out there that are going, oh, TikTok. But for what I do, it's worked out really well. And it's brought me here.
Yeah, well, I will say we're embracing a lot of different social media platforms in an effort to put out our content and what we're doing. And so, yeah, we're not shy about TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. Like, we try and hit them all. And you're very right. I mean, it's amazing the audiences that you'll pick up per platform. And you find that you reach different people every channel that you use.
Exactly right.
But, so one of the reasons that we wanted to sit down with you, though, and talk about some of the work that you've done is, you have a really interesting background. And one of the things that we were talking about before you had hopped on today is like your background starts in Los Angeles and moves to Shanghai, and now you're in Melbourne. Can you walk us a little bit through where did you get started and what ignited this passion of yours around environmentalism and educating businesses and others around it?
I'm sure my therapist would have something to say about me continuously moving further and further away from home, but beyond that, I have lived sort of all over the world. Born and raised in Los Angeles, and then moved to New York to do grad school and to sort of get close to the United Nations, which is where I started my career. But kind of did grad school and had a job at the UN at the same time while I was finishing my degree, which is a great thing. And that's where I really got started in what I thought was going to be a career in politics, but really quickly took on more of an altruistic kind of save the world bent, which is what the UN's good for. And after being there for several years, I realized, okay, John, you call yourself this international citizen, but you haven't really lived overseas. So why not, make the jump? And I went to Shanghai just on a bit of a vacation. I think this was 2008. And I don't know if you've been to Shanghai, but that place is capitalism on steroids. Like everybody's living high off the hog. They're having these amazing times going out, having fancy dinners, all this sort of stuff. And I go back to New York at the height of the global recession, and everybody is just struggling. And I thought, okay, John, time to pack the bags and go to Shanghai, check it out for a couple of years and see how it goes. And 10 years later, I'm still there looking for the next opportunity somewhere else,
Wow.
which landed me here in Australia. So it's been quite a ride, and I don't have any intention of going home just yet. But I think certainly, given I was in Shanghai for 10 years, and that's where I built my sustainability chops, because I kind of fell into it accidentally, trying to figure out, okay, in this super commercial city, how do you marry that with all of the public sector experience that you got at the UN? And sustainability for me is kind of the mixture of the two, which I'm sure we'll get into. But given that so much of that experience is in Asia Pacific, I thought, okay, Australia needs my help. It's kind of the same region of the world, so let's head there as well. And I've been here now going on 4-ish years, pandemic notwithstanding. And yeah, it's just really seeing myself kind of in this part of the world for a while, I think, a while more before I go home.
So, when you started working with the UN, what was the work that you were doing there?
So the UN's an amazing place because once you're in, it's really hard to leave. They don't want you to leave. So they love to bounce you around into lots of different positions. It's sort of like everyone's a trained generalist, and every year and a half-ish, they kind of expect you to move to a different role somewhere in the organization. So that's a great thing because it gives you lots of exposure to different stuff. The hard part's getting in. So I was at the right place at the right time and got a job just in an editorial department. That's also something really low level editorial. And from there was able to bounce around working in things like decolonization, post conflict peace building, nuclear disarmament, and my last role was in counterterrorism. So you can really see I don't have an expertise in any of those things because they're so random, but really great from a generalist knowledge perspective. And I think really honing those generalist chops has helped me as I've moved out to be a consultant, because as a consultant, you have to be a generalist. You have to be able to absorb and analyze information super quickly to then spit out enough to sound intelligent about something to a client that's paying you money. So it worked out quite well.
That is quite a mix of areas of focus, because you would think that counterterrorism might not have much to do with environmentalism, but I don't know. Maybe there's some interesting connections there where there are some relatable things that aren't coming to my mind right away.
Everything relates to environmentalism somehow. And I think it's a bit of, I guess, framing. I don't know if I would call myself an environmentalist. I term myself a pragmatic altruist, which
Oh,
is
yeah.
kind of floofy, but I certainly focus more in the grand scheme of things. When I talk about sustainability, it's an umbrella term for anything helping to bring about a better future. That could be the environment, the green side of things, which is important and gets the lion's share of the PR. But there's also a whole social element, which has been my focus, certainly when I lived and worked in China, going into factories, working with individual workers, helping to upskill and making sure the labor practices were right. That whole element of it, the people side of it, is where I really got going with sustainability. But now I'm kind of sitting in boardrooms working on the governance side, which is making sure corporations are doing what they say they're supposed to do and then communicating it in the right way so they're not lying. So sustainability really is multifaceted. The green part gets the most attention, but there's a lot more going on behind the scenes as well.
I've spent my career in the supply chain side of the consumer products goods industry. And so I think one of the things that you get a unique visibility into in a role like that is around things like packaging and transportation and waste. And, how do you manage all of those things as a company? Because you want to create nice, shiny, attractive things for people to buy, but then you got to worry also about, okay, what happens next? What happens after that? Or even in putting it together, right? Because there's certainly no shortage of stories of really bad decisions that created some really bad impacts down the road. McDonald's famously with the styrofoam packaging for their Big Macs and the impact that had. And then they've certainly changed that and done things differently. About 10 years ago, I used to work with Coca-Cola and was with Coca-Cola for 20 years. Very well known for creating a lot of waste around the world. So these things are very upfront and real for a lot of companies. In fact, I was just telling Alan and Keith before we got on, I was watching a 60-minute special recently around e-waste and the number of e-waste that gets dumped in Ghana and all of the issues around that are created. And specifically, they focused in on things like cell phones because cell phones are kind of this throwaway product. Once you get them for a year or two, they come out with something nice and different, and people want that nice and different thing. And it was interesting. They tried to get Apple in the interview, were unable to get Apple. They did get Samsung. And I think one of the things that really surprised me in that interview was as they were talking to one of the executives at Samsung, they were explaining the situation in Ghana. And the gentleman says, "We've only recently come aware of that as well. And so we're trying to create these recycling centers, more recycling centers around the world." And I'm thinking to myself, like, I don't know, that those pictures you're showing seems like that stuff's been there for a while. How are you only now figuring this stuff out?
Someone wasn't media trained because,
Right.
either way, they're going to make the wrong answer. Either you knew about it and you didn't do anything, or you didn't know about it, so you don't know what's going on in your supply chain. It's a
John,
disaster.
You said something that really struck me. And so now, in business schools, we're teaching the four primary environments, right? But they've added environment to and the green concept. So yeah,
Sustainability.
and
Yeah.
it depends on ecological, right? And so the economic, technological, socio-political, and the as it goes on down the line, now you see ecological, and then you said that you're spending most of your time in the boardroom, making sure they don't lie, right? And some of the strategies associated with green, we are a green company, seem to be fluff in the past, as I've observed. But could you talk more about what some of those strategies are that because when you said we're making sure they don't lie, well, how do you do that?
It's having the right things in place to begin with. And I think the strategy wise, and that's where a lot of companies haven't had in the past. A lot of companies do say they're clean, they're green, they're sustainable, X, Y, and Z, but there really is no company that exists on the face of the earth that is 100% sustainable. It just doesn't exist. So there are bits and pieces of that business that are sustainable, that are truly green. And that's the part we want to tease out and get them talking about. We don't want them making up stories to try to impress stakeholders or consumers or anybody in finance to try to make them look better than they are. And that's the hard part because obviously companies and especially marketing and PR departments love to tell white lies. Sometimes they're not even white lies to really help out their reputation. And when it comes to things like greenwashing, which is where a company will say it's sustainable or green when really they're not, there's different levels of that. There's the companies that have it built into the marketing mix, the lies, the big oil and gas and mining companies, those ones where you look at them and they tell you they're doing good for the planet and you go, no, you're not. Like, why are you still investing millions of dollars into marketing to try to lie to me? I know much better than that. So there's those companies and they still do it. It's shocking how much they continue to do this. It was ExxonMobil had a full page spread in, I think it was Business Insider, during the UN's climate summit in September, talking about their green credentials. And these are to people in the climate space that know much better than a general consumer, but they still think we're silly. So that's one part of the lying. But then there's others that maybe they're just starting their sustainability journey. Maybe they've overpromised and underdelivered, or said something the wrong way. Accidental. We can fix that. That's okay. And that's totally fine. So there's different levels of the lies that we see coming out of corporations. It's getting those strategies in place. And I think the key thing that I've always found working with companies is making sure they're focusing on what's most material to the business first and foremost. A lot of times they want to do everything. There's 100 different things they need to do to become green, but you try to do everything, you're going to accomplish nothing. So the focus really should be on 3 or 5 issues that are most important to their internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, and they can really sink their teeth into and make a difference. Once those things are solved, then we'll move on to the next stuff. You don't have to do it all today. So that's the real strategy for businesses going forward, is to look at this in small chunks versus trying to, I'll use an overused marketing jargon, boil the ocean.
So, John, when you think about the work that you're doing and the things that you're really trying to get done, if you had to think about maybe the top 3 or 5 biggest issues that we need to be talking about, what are some of those things that come to mind?
That's a very good question, because like I was just saying 2 minutes ago, there's so much to do and we want to do it all, but definitely needing to focus in on those biggest issues. I think certainly for, let's say, the general public, anybody listening to this, people maybe starting in business school or just consumers in general, to really first and foremost get a sense of what we're talking about and a shared definition of sustainability. So when I started talking to you all, really explaining what sustainability is, so we're all on the same page. And then, especially for consumers, I know right now that it's tough to be green and to do good. Everybody sort of wants to, or at least they say on a survey that they want to, but it takes research. It probably takes more money if you want to purchase something that's organic or green. I get all that. But that's sort of where we are in the process of things. We're, fortunate to, as we've experienced over the last 10 years, live in a transition period in history, which is tumultuous and frustrating, but that's where we are. So doing your research, really making sure that you're speaking with your wallet. And had I heard myself say those words 5 years ago, I would have laughed at myself. But I think it's so important. And I don't know why I came to this epiphany so late, but businesses listen. We talk a lot about capitalism, and I work within the capitalist system. I'm not advocating to overthrow capitalism because it's what we have. So let's work within it until some brilliant economic minds find something new. So within that, the silver lining is that businesses respond to where you're spending your money. A sizable portion of businesses have changed the way they do things because consumers no longer want to be associated with them. People want to be proud of the stuff they eat and wear. So really letting your money speak for itself, I think, is a right way to go for consumers. That's one way for them to kind of get over the line of making a difference. And I think certainly the third big thing is to get over this idea of we're doomed. It's called doomism, and it's become quite a big thing, especially for consumers, but also for businesses, where I'm one of 10 billion people and we're going to hell in a handbasket. What am I supposed to do about it? I give up. Don't do that. It's very easy to do that. But for consumers and for everybody that's listening to this, it's really important that whatever little piece of the sustainability universe you're contributing to, whatever it is you're bringing to the table, keep going, because there's still plenty that can be done. And yeah, there's still a lot of work to do, but it's not like, we're done, we're doomed. The earth will adapt, we will adapt, we are adapting. And so we just need to keep pushing on as much as possible, moving the needle in the right direction and not focusing on being perfect, because there is no such thing.
So, as you were saying that, one of the things I was thinking of when you talk about the doom, and certainly not giving up is important. But I think what is also important is to not feel like we have to if we don't make drastic changes now, then everything's going to expire and go away or blow up. And I tend to be on that side of like, we have to do things wisely. We can't keep going the way that we're going, but we also can't just dead stop and try and, like first we're going to stop and then we're going to try and fix it. No, it's got to be this thing that is evolving as we're doing it. And where we can cut things immediately, we should absolutely. But it also, I think, what is challenging sometimes for consumers, and I think the danger is it makes a lot of people cynical, is when you try and put this message out there that we've got to do something right now or we're done for.
And interestingly enough, going on behind the scenes, a lot of those statistics and messages, particularly on social media, that are being pushed around, how bad things are, that's actually, this should not come as a shock, but it will be. Those are actually supported and financed by the oil industry. So they're not unbiased scientific opinions. It's the new iteration of their type of marketing. They're infiltrating social media to try to throw us off the scent. And it's not every single person that posts, doomist type messages, but a lot of that stuff that's coming out is supported by the dirty polluting industries. So, which is why we should all take it with a grain of salt. And I think, at the very beginning, I wanted to clarify that I don't consider myself kind of in that activist community, because I think that has a particular connotation of wanting things to happen 100% right now, as if we're operating with some sort of an on or off switch, which is not true. These issues that we're facing, the work that we're doing, is so highly nuanced and difficult and intricate. We talked about supply chain, we talked about business students, we talked about consumers. This stuff is not as easy as just saying shut it down, because that is not realistic. We talk a lot about in the profession. I can't believe I just said that, but in the profession, we talk about what's called a just transition, which is not something we really tell to to everybody else. But a just transition is basically, okay, for example, if you're going to shut down all of these oil refineries, that's great for the environment. What do you do with all the people that are now going to be out of a job that can't support their families, right? So it's not as easy as just shutting the doors of a place, because there are knock-on effects to all of that. And then what happens to, I don't know, places in the developing world that might rely on the income to that to build up their entire economies? So it's so nuanced, and I think it's quite uninformed opinion that a lot of those maybe on the more activist side of things have, where they say, oh, just shut the whole thing down, because that's not going to get us anywhere.
The strategist in me is dying listening to you like a prophet, a voice crying in the desert, a voice of one writing these books and all that. And you want the general public to do all these things and get smart. Where are the pockets of excellence? Who's bigger than John? And how do you leverage those things to create a strategic push that can actually make these things happen?
Absolutely. There's plenty of it going on. I am not the lone prophet, hopefully. Maybe I'm just the loudest one. But there's plenty of this happening. The example I'd love to give, especially when people from North America are listening, is, and this is going to shock people, Walmart is a great example, a great case study of who is doing it right. And I know they are Satan incarnate in the United States. I get it. They're terrible for their people. They're terrible for mom and pop shops. They're bad, really bad. But when it comes to what they're doing in the developing world, especially in their supply chains in Asia, they're doing incredible stuff, and they're really leading the way. You go into these factories, and I know people have preconceived notions of what it means to be in a factory. You think it's, thousands of people toiling over little widgets doing things. And no, these places are automated now. They're nice places to be. They're air conditioned. They're automated. And of course, there's still people that have to do work. We don't have machines for everything. But the work that I did, I worked with Walmart as a consultant way back when, helping with what's called the Women in Factories program. It was a 3-year program funded by the Walmart Foundation. This is not an advertisement for them. But they invested millions of dollars to upskill their female workers, not just on the job stuff, but personal health and wellness, communication skills, family planning, financial literacy. It runs the gamut. And the rationale was not, we didn't go in there and propose this program saying, oh, do good for your women because it's the right thing to do. No, because we'll get laughed out of the room. It wasn't about that. It was about the bottom line. And I have no problem talking about sustainability, doing good, plus the bottom line. And this is the way we approached it. And I hope this is okay for the audience, but here we go. So in China, abortion is considered a proper form of contraception. Now, if you consider the numbers and you have half of your factory are female workers, if at any one time maybe half of them are out having a procedure or recovering from a procedure, they're not going to show up to work. And when they do, they're not going to be productive and they're probably not going to be too happy about it. But you turn that on its head and you start to do educational programs around, okay, there are other options for you when it comes to this particular piece of health and wellness. All of a sudden, they're happier, they're healthier, they're showing up to work, attrition goes down, productivity goes up, and the bottom line is bolstered. That's how we want to see things going. That's a proper example of a strong strategy to really create change. And we're not talking about a half dozen women that went through this program. I think at the end of the 3 years, it was close to 500,000 women went through this program directly.
Wow.
And then
Wow.
they used a train the trainer approach. So there are umpteen exponential more
Wow.
numbers of people who would have been impacted secondhand through all of this. So that's the kind of work that the private sector can do and why I focus on the private sector. A, they got us into this mess, so they should get us out of it. But B, they have capital and resources that individuals could never imagine having, and certainly governments are not willing to use. So, of course, it makes sense to work with these large private sector companies to not just make sure they're doing the right things, but in a lot of ways to hold their hand to show them the right way to do those things so that they can impact things at scale. That's just one example. Those type of programs exist across India, China, Vietnam, and Myanmar. I can rattle off a dozen of similar programs at similar scale that are happening. The issue is that these companies don't talk about it because it seems disingenuous to go boast about all of these good things you're doing. I wish more companies like Walmart would talk about that, but I think if they were to, a lot of those who are on the activist side of things would nitpick and do a lot of whataboutism and say, oh, all this is a problem, instead of looking at the amazing, impactful case study of the positive work that is happening.
John, as I look at the activists that you mentioned that don't seem to be helping you out very much and probably harming what it is you do, which is, I mean, this type of revelation for the business world and so forth, understanding greenwashing and then understanding how companies are fixing it. I had the good fortune of being in Bentonville, Arkansas, and seeing Walmart. And so the activists' takeaway, that they can contribute some negatively to the situation and opportunities that you're trying to create. But tell me about the opponents, or is there an opponent of this green stuff is not needed? The world, as we said earlier, will adapt. And then you've got the activists and how does that get in your way?
It's a great question. And the activist community, I don't want to discount them because they definitely serve a role in everything that's going on to rattle things and to get that awareness out there. And they have been at the forefront of what we've needed to do to raise awareness since the start of the modern environmental movement back in the 1960s. They've done an amazing thing. I think, unfortunately, as time has gone on and as these movements have sort of grown and morphed, I think a lot of them have kind of lost sight of what they're trying to do, particularly in how they're positioning their messaging and the approaches that they're using. And I'm a big believer that at this stage of the game, now it's been 60 plus years of the movement, we've raised awareness. If at this point people don't know what's going on, or they refuse to listen, or they're antagonistic and they get in the way, we can't really focus our attention on them because it's a distraction. So let's focus on those people that do care because there's plenty of them. So our goal no longer is to raise awareness. Our goal now is to convert people to do something, because that's where the missing piece is. People are sitting back going, okay, I know there's something going on, but this problem's so big, what am I supposed to do about it? That's our goal now. So how do we convert them? How do we get them over the line? And I think a big way of doing that is to approach them on their level as they are, with realistic solutions, with realistic case studies of maybe businesses that are doing things, explaining to them that it's not as easy as black and white and flipping a switch, and showing that you don't necessarily have to take these extreme measures to make a difference. I was in a panel about a month ago, sitting on the panel with someone who is probably more in the activist mindset of things, and we were approaching the conversation very differently, as you can imagine. And at one point, I stopped and I said, okay, for this audience, let's do a little show of hands. And this is an audience that has wasted an hour of their life to come listen to us talk at them. So they obviously care somewhat. So they're the 1% that care. I said, okay, you all raise your hand if you want to become a vegetarian. A few people raised their hand. Great. Okay, how many vegans are here? A few fewer hands. How many of you would give up your cell phones? No hands. How many of you would go live off the grid? No hands. How many of you would give up international travel? No hands. And that's the 1% that cares. So if they're not going to do it, if that's not realistic, why do we keep shoving this message out there, especially for the 99% of people who think that's way too extreme to begin with? We need to approach them with these small, manageable things they can do to really make a difference. So those are the kind of things that folks in my space are up against. Those of us that are more pragmatic and working with business and approaching these things from more of a nuanced perspective is, how do we get that message out there? Because there might be a lot of us, and I don't think I'm alone in sort of that mentality of how to approach this, but we're also not as loud as we should be. Certainly not against a lot of the activists who, they have quite a machine behind them because they've been operating a lot longer than we have. So they have that marketing machine to help them get the message out. And, when you're up against somebody who's screaming next to you, you're probably just going to disengage anyways. It's hard to fight against somebody who's just angry and yelling.
Right.
But at the same time, I do tend to agree with you that there are certainly circumstances where you have to be loud. You have to get people's attention. You have to say that there's something wrong here and call it for what it is,
Mhm.
and then kind of allow that change to happen. And we mentioned Go ahead.
A great circle back to what we were originally talking about, and how we originally met was looking at Steve Donziger, who's the name of the lawyer in the Amazon, and the work he did against Chevron Texaco trying to protect portions of the Amazon. And he's only one person. These things have been going on in the Amazon for forever. But the approach that he used, the approach that similar people, especially indigenous populations, have used, of literally sitting their bodies between tractors and trees and raising awareness that way, absolutely has a purpose. And I 100% advocate and support measures like that. But I suppose when I think about the messaging not working, I'm thinking more about throwing tomato soup at Van Gogh. Like, what does that have to do with anything? And so it's
gluing your hand to a street.
all
or
it does is
anything.
aggravate people. And I think we kind of understand what that looks like, and the mismessaged sort of protest, right? You go to one and you might see a few witty signs that are out there, which are always fun to read. People who are really passionate banging a drum, but then it eventually devolves into somebody putting makeup on someone, and there's probably a fire dancer there, someone with hula hoops, and somebody from the outside is looking at that going, okay, what's your message? What are you trying to tell me about? And so that's kind of the ones I
Right.
take issue with. But if the message is super clear and you're sitting your body between a tractor and a tree, I get that, and I can advocate and bear it for you in that sense. But it's the mismessaged activism that
Yeah.
is problematic.
I will say, looking at organizations like Greenpeace or PETA, there are certainly tactics they've used that I don't necessarily look at and go like, I can get on board with that. But at the same time, there are other things they've done that have certainly called attention to terrible practices that are going on that needed to be changed. So certainly you can't completely disregard all of the things that are happening there, but there is definitely some good to come out of it.
And certainly the reason I bring it up is not to tell them to stop. I want them to be better at what they're doing, because I know they can have a big impact. They just need to tweak a little bit about how they're approaching it to really up the impact, which is what we want to see.
Are there any conversations to do that, though?
That's the question.
It's not going to happen if it's a.
I don't know if there are, honestly speaking. I mean, I think their tactics are their tactics. And that's sort of these newer incarnations, the Just Stop Oils, the Extinction Rebellions, but for the more of the seasoned, so the PETAs and the Greenpeaces and those larger organizations that have been there kind of from the very beginning, they're very smart. So they know how to change tack. They operate in many ways, just like businesses, and they know they need to survive as well. So they know to change tack and to respond to the market. So in their boardrooms, those conversations must be happening.
So, Jen, as I listen to this, and what has kind of weighed on my head going into this conversation is, I think about the, you kind of want to work from big to small, right? And some of the biggest attention getters, I think, for companies, industries that are probably in my view, and correct me if I'm wrong here, where the biggest work needs to be done. Oil industry, electronics industry, and textiles, because it's funny we don't really talk about the pollution that textile companies do with dyes and fabrics and things being strewn all over the place, but they are as big a culprit in my mind as the oil companies are. And so what when you think about those industries, can you give me some examples of some companies that are, we've already mentioned Walmart, which they're more of the retailer bringing things in. And what's great about that is that they put pressure on the companies. I know from working at Coke, they put pressure on companies to get people to do what they want because they have the um, size and mass to do that. They can squeeze people in a good way. And so when you think about those industries, are there companies that are doing great, and are there companies that will just say have opportunity to do better?
Yeah, it's interesting. So in the research for the Great Greenwashing, I looked at different industries, and we think there's hundreds and hundreds of different sectors that are out there, but it all kind of boils down to like 20 or 25 sectors at the end of the day. And at one end of that are the what I call the unsustainable. So the ones that until they close their doors, nothing they do is really going to make a difference that offsets the negative that they're having. So it comes down to oil and gas, mining, defense, and tobacco. Those four. Nothing they do will ever be okay. So they're, I hate to say lost cause, but I think there's certainly a distraction from the work that can be done in a positive way with the other industry sectors. So that's one end of the scale. At the other end of the scale, you have companies and sectors that are far from perfect, but because they tend to be highly regulated, are doing a bit better than most. So pharmaceutical, healthcare, medtech, and finance, but I don't even talk about finance in the Great Greenwashing because that's just a black box I didn't want to look into. So those industries that are highly regulated tend to be a bit better. Again, not perfect, but better than most. The other 17-ish industries kind of sit in the middle, different shades of gray when it comes to how well they're doing. And as we talked about at the beginning, it's not 100% within any of them. They may be doing really well in their supply chain, but terrible with transparency. Who knows? So to your question, within that, I think the ones that we should really be focused on that can do much more than they probably are. You mentioned textiles, 100% a highly polluting industry in a lot of ways, but also given the size and the focus of attention that consumers have, that's a great opportunity to get them over the line doing great things. I look at some of the not the major fashion houses like the old like Chanel's and whatnot, but sort of that next level down. So between fast fashion and a fashion house. Some of those are doing great things. You mentioned how they squeeze their suppliers and how they make sure that's going well. And that isn't just when it comes to labor standards and factory production, but also wastewater, throwing things out into the air, all that sort of stuff, and also making sure that they're complying with governmental regulation. So that is a great spot for them to be in, and certainly is making a positive impact. So any of those type of companies in the textile area, and including their second and third tier suppliers as well, is all certainly helpful. And in that area too, you have agriculture, which is usually propped up as the worst of the worst next to the oil industry because of the negative impact it has on the planet. We have to eat. There's a growing amount of people in the world, a growing number of middle class people with disposable income who will eventually eat meat. So it's not as if we can get rid of that industry either. So there's a lot of great movements happening, particularly from the likes of Nestle. I know people are going to come at me for saying that, but they're using their size and scope to try to be better. Again, they're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but they're trying within the scope of things. They're trying to, I think of some of the examples of what Nestle's doing in the north of China around dairy production, farming. They're making innovations, and they're certainly collaborating with the central government to try to help further along governmental regulation that at the end of the day will get them into this virtuous cycle of exponentially improving the things that they're doing. That's kind of the scope of things. It's sort of those two, agriculture and textiles, fashion always pop up in my mind. Everyone else is kind of just muddling along.
So you kind of touched on your book there. I want to go back a little bit. The first book that you put out, you talk about pragmatic altruism. Help those who have not heard that term. How did you come to that term? What does that really mean and resonate with?
I should trademark it, actually. I don't know why I haven't. Like I said, I call myself a pragmatic altruist. So breaking it down, altruism is just care for things besides yourself. So anybody who cares for the planet, cares for people, is by their nature an altruist. Most of us are altruists. We care about something more than ourselves. Pragmatism, though, is looking at how you do that strategically. And we talked a lot about activists and how some of their messaging is not strategic. And that's, I think, in that section of sustainability for the rest of us, that's where I start out the conversation of looking at, okay, how can I bring my best self to this, do the most impactful, positive work that I can? I can do that by being strategic and pragmatic about my approach. And I touch on it as well in The Great Greenwashing, where at the end of the book, I turn the mirror on ourselves and I say, hey, are we greenwashing too? Are we thinking that, X, Y, and Z thing that we're doing day in and day out is having such a big impact, but really we could be doing A, B, and C instead, and, it's going to be even better. One of the things I didn't come up with this idea, I don't know where I heard it, but the notion that you can do anything, but you can't do everything, I think is so important to help us frame how we approach trying to save the planet. Because for those of us who do care, we care probably too much. So we go outside, I go outside, I want to adopt every dog, I want to feed every homeless person, and I want to go read to the elderly on the weekends. I'm only one person. I only have so much capacity, financial, acumen and sanity to be able to do any of that stuff. And if I try to do it all, I'm just going to burn out. And I think that's where a lot of people are. They're trying to do it all and they're burnt out and they say, forget it. I'm pushing, junk uphill. And that's not what we want. We don't want people burnt out. We want people focused and focusing on an area that you're either super passionate about, maybe you have a special skill in, or if you are financially well off, you can contribute to, because money helps out the cause. So really focusing in on where your little piece of the universe is going to be goes a long way to get you towards being a real pragmatic altruist.
And so when you talk about the 5-point plan for sustainability, help us understand that a little bit.
Yeah, so the key linchpin in all that is that idea of pragmatic altruism. So really making sure that you're doing things strategically. And I also tease in as a second point that idea of doing anything but not everything is super important. The third is, and this was a section geared towards academics, those in the activist community primarily, and I'm not going to say it because the book's actually full of expletives, which makes it really hard to promote sometimes. But it's a section.
That's all right. We're good.
It's a section really around boiled down understanding your audience and how you approach them. An example I think a lot of people can probably understand is sitting at a table with a vegan. There's nothing wrong with being vegan. I'm not a vegan, but if that's your thing, more power to you. But having somebody yell at you for eating meat or saying they don't like the smell of the meat or making it all about them is probably not the best approach when you're trying to get people to understand your side of things and how you approach the world. So really looking at how you address your messaging is a section of the book. There's a fourth section about getting a shared understanding of things, which is great. We're kind of touching on all five points in this talk, which is nice. And the last one is around just doing it. Don't try, do. The famous quote from Yoda, don't try, do. Because a lot of times we're sitting around going, okay, I know I should do all this stuff, but maybe I don't have the time, or it's too much to do, I don't want to do it. Just get out there and do it. Because the world's waiting for people to get out there and add their little bit of expertise to try to save the planet, because we need all hands on deck.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too, it's important to not feel like it's got to be 100% all the time. There are times when, I don't put the proper trash in the right bin, and I forgive myself with that, and I go on with my life,
Terrible. This is over. We're done.
No, but the reality is that you're not going to be perfect every single day. And the other thing too is there is that old saying of lead by example, and don't necessarily lead by beating people over the head with it. If you do something and you become an example for that thing that you're passionate about, that resonates so much more than going and lecturing everybody about how good you are.
That's exactly right. And a fun little anecdote is, we think a lot about, and a lot of people peg their being perfect or the perfect environmentalist to those carbon footprint calculators. Everybody talks about the carbon footprint calculator, how big their footprint is, all this sort of stuff. But fun fact, that carbon footprint calculator was actually created by Edelman and British Petroleum because they wanted a way to sell their sustainability reports.
I love
That
it.
was back in 2004. 2004, they brought in Edelman. I think it was Edelman. It was one of the big PR firms. And they said, hey, nobody's reading our sustainability report. What do we do? Oh, make this carbon footprint calculator, not so they could calculate their footprint, but so they could turn it on us to make us feel guilty for ours. So, the fact that people have put
Nice.
such a focus on
Nice.
that really is demonstrative of, why being a perfect environmentalist or a perfect do-gooder is probably the wrong approach.
Yeah.
It's about incremental change. I'm very much an advocate for moving the needle in the right direction, not trying to do 100% of anything because it's A, not realistic, but B, you're probably being duped somehow, which is unfortunate, but it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I want to say my wife recently received a package, and I'm trying to remember who it was from, but they actually put in the packaging what your carbon footprint was for receiving this order. So, and I'm like, I don't know that helps you sell more product, but thank you for the
Yeah.
information.
Well, the only
The one
relevant
that
thing
gets
there
me
would
is-
be if I picked up a package and stepped in dog crap, because the real footprint would be on the carpet when I walked in.
right there.
That's what my wife would be worried about. So
Your methane footprint would go
That's
up
it.
too.
Exactly right. Brilliant. And you see it a lot today too. The one that's gotten me recently is, you go to book a flight somewhere and you can offset your flight by joining, like I'm in Australia and Qantas is the
Oh, yeah.
national carrier. And they have this thing where you can join the green tier, right? It's one of these frequent flyer type tiers. And you have to pay for the privilege. Why am I going to pay you to fix your problem? Like, I'm already paying you an exorbitant amount for my ticket. I'm not going to pay you to. There's no incentive for Qantas to change their ways. If I'm paying you, they're not going to take it
Yeah.
and fix what they're doing. So it's totally out of control.
I have seen that there are actually a couple US carriers that are allowing you to pay for carbon credits or whatever as part of your ticket.
They're so
And
magnanimous, these companies. Where won't they stop?
I wasn't quite sure where that came from, and I have no idea how much money they're collecting, but that's an interesting new thing that is being put out there. So Jen, when you talk about misleading tactics, and I know that's something that you get into in the greenwashing book, I'm not asking you to give away too much because we want people to go buy the book too. But what are some interesting tactics that companies use as a means of greenwashing?
Yeah, it comes in three big forms. The first is the green speak. That's the traditional kind of marketing around being green. So it's the use, and I'm going to use a fancy marketing word, semiotics, which is how images and visuals denote meaning. So it's the green box that is supposed to say, oh, we're clean because our box is green. Or the advertisement of a car driving through a lush forest. All of this denotes meaning to you, whether or not it's true or not. One of my favorites, one of my last places living in Shanghai was kind of across the road from this massive building site. They're building one of the biggest skyscrapers in the city. And if you've been to Shanghai, the city is full of big skyscrapers. So super dirty, polluted kind of industrial building site. But on the outside, they had this high wood fence to sort of block out, the view from the street. And on that fence were pictures, and I kid you not, of rolling hills with cows and lambs.
nice.
And this is an insane example of semiotics trying to throw you off the scent of what's happening just on the other side of that fence, which you can clearly see. So that's one of the ways it happens. There's a lot of misdirection that goes on. So look over here, not over here. Look at this cute picture of kids on the front of our sustainability report, but don't look at the child labor in Bangladesh. We don't want you to see that part. Or, over inundating you with information is another classic way of doing this. I worked with a fashion house, it would have been years ago, developing their sustainability report. And they wanted me to create a 500-page sustainability report full of data, spreadsheets, every little bit of information. And their idea was that they were being hyper transparent. But at the end of the day, they're just burying you in data, so you can't really find the information that you're looking for. And the third is what's called green scamming. So, this is, like we alluded to a little earlier, when highly polluting industries will pay for fake data to be put into social media. For years, they've created non governmental organizations that, on the face of them, seem like they're doing good things for the planet, but they're actually funded by highly polluting companies. So, these front lobbying organizations exist. And also within that, there's what's called, it's a new thing, and there's all these different terms, but blue washing, which is where a company will overstate its commitment to social issues when it probably doesn't really care too much about it. A great example, it would have been 2020 during the height of the Black Lives Matter protests. Kendall Jenner, I think it was her, did an ad for Pepsi where she
Yep.
gave a Pepsi to a police officer, and the implication is that she was able to solve systemic racism in the United States and police brutality all because of a soda. The ad was pulled within 24 hours because obviously people did not want to hear anything about that, especially not from somebody who takes her private jet to go get her mail. So it did not work. So that's another way that companies try to throw us off the scent.
Yeah, so when you think about that, as a really good example, by the way. I had forgotten about that, but that was I remember the stir that that created. So, John, the reason that you got into doing this work, there was an inspiration that hit you to kind of move you in this direction. What was that moment, that aha moment, if there was one moment or maybe several, where you said, you know what, this is kind of my calling. I need to go and help bring awareness to this issue because this can't go on.
It's probably everybody's sort of origin story. When you get to that point and you realize I could do this better than my boss.
Yeah.
That's when you sort of end up setting up a consultancy. Anybody who's a consultant, that's the clinching moment. And that's kind of where I was at one point of realizing maybe not so much just my boss, but looking at a massive gap in where things were actually happening versus where things needed to be. That was my inspiration. And the gap that I noticed was really around that strategic, pragmatic part of sustainability and how to work with private sector companies. Again, that aha moment of that's the group of stakeholders that can actually make the biggest difference, even though they're vilified all the time. They're the ones I want to work with. It was the moment when I realized, okay, it's time to sort of set up your own shop and begin working with them, but also then communicating out to, as I do in the books, to everyday people. That sounds so patronizing. I don't mean it that way, but to everybody else, where, a lot of times they look at this idea of sustainability and saving the world as such a jargon heavy, scientific, confusing type of area, but one they know they want to do something with. So I really see my goal and the way I approach my writing is more of just having a conversation. I don't do technical writing. I try to keep the big words out of the writing as much as possible, which my editor doesn't always like. They like it to be a little bit more floofy and academic, but people have told me, it's like I'm having a conversation with you versus I'm reading a book, which is how it should be. If we want people to change, and we talked about messaging so much today, we have to approach them in a way that is easy to understand and then do something about.
Well, it's funny. One of the things I often joke about is, I went from working 20 years in consumer packaged goods, Coca-Cola, and I've been working now for the last 10 or so years in the wine industry. And I always say it's a much healthier drink. In this industry, there's a focus on things like biodiversity. There's a focus on organic farming. There's a focus on, hey, maybe we shouldn't make the bottles so heavy. And, we can lighten the weight of the bottle. It used to be a trend that a heavy bottle conveyed a sense of, kind of a premium wine, like premium wines are put in a heavier bottle. And for the most part, we've moved away from that. More people are realizing that just weight alone, it adds more, not just more cost, but more weight, and more weight means more fuel when you're transporting product. And like all of these things, they resonate, they all connect in some manner. So I think your strategy around going after organizations, you're 100% right. These are the people who are doing the most, they're moving the needle the most, either in a good way or in a bad way. And for the most part, in my experience working with a lot of different companies, companies generally want to do better. They want their employees to feel good about where they work. They want their consumers to feel good about the products that they're buying. And they also want to stay out of the negative headlines. And so by focusing that attention and saying, look, folks, here are some things you can do that will move the needle, make people feel better about your products, about, working with you, about doing business with you. And I got to imagine that emerging technologies are always improving some of this as well. Like we're figuring out how to do things faster, better, cheaper all of the time. And anytime you can tell a COO or a CFO, hey, if you move the needle over here, it's going to make this impact on the other side. And at the end of the day, it's going to save you money, or it's going to cut down on waste or transportation, or any of that stuff. I mean, they're going to listen.
And they do listen. And the funny thing is, they're funny or frustrating, however you want to see it, is getting them to the point of not just hearing you say those words, but internalizing that can actually be a thing where sustainability can have a positive impact on the bottom line, and them to really get that. And that takes case studies, that takes them experiencing it themselves. That's what gets them over the line. But that is sometimes a very bitter pill for CFOs to swallow, and I don't know why that is, because they're money driven and it should make sense. But in my experience, they, especially at the large institutional historic kind of blue chip organizations, they have a hard time changing their ways. They're not nimble. They know they're going to have pressure from all sides, so not always an easy conversation. Where I find things to be much easier, and where I tend to enjoy working a lot more, with the small and medium businesses, because they understand that sustainability needs to be embedded because consumers are demanding it, but also they look at things from a valuation perspective. For a lot of SMEs, they're especially small startups, their goal is to sell at some point in the near future, and they know that investors want to see that stuff. So they don't have any of these entrenched old school traditional practices that they need to upset. They can put things in the right order, ducks in a row, the right direction from the get-go, and it's good for the financials. So the small and medium businesses are really the ones to watch when it comes to having proper green credentials, because they were kind of built that way from the ground up, which is interesting to see.
As you were talking about that, it reminded me of a story I heard when it was about McDonald's. Something that I don't think a lot of people understand is that big companies don't make changes quickly because there's a lot of cascading impact to that. And so some people might remember when McDonald's came out with salad shakers here in the US, which is, the salad that you put in a cup and you shake it around. And the story I heard around this was that it took them a year to grow the produce, to provide the supply chain to come out with that product. That, you can't just go into a room and be like, hey guys, salad, let's do it next week. It took them an entire year just to be able to have the product availability to launch a campaign and put that forward. So if it takes us that long to put out salad in a cup at McDonald's, we can't expect to make these immediate changes. And oh, by the way, there was this thing called the global pandemic that shows us what happens when we stop a supply chain.
Yeah.
and how it impacts the world. So it's, it isn't something that we can always just flip on and off like a light switch.
And this is a total aside and nothing to do with sustainability. This is just more market related, but we talked about R&D and the R&D process for a lot of these large, particularly Western companies. So in China, they approach R&D very differently than the traditional Western model. The traditional Western model, a couple of years, right? Very detailed, lots of market research, because at the end of the day, the goal is to have that perfect product at the end that is going to sell, that's going to work. So that's how it works. It takes a long time to get there, just like you mentioned with salad. That's the R&D process in the West. China, they do sort of live market research. So I think the latest numbers, this is again pre-pandemic, China's putting out a new SKU every 7 minutes onto shelves.
Wow.
That's how fast their R&D process goes, because their approach is more throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. So they do live market research. They'll produce, 15 different products, put it on a shelf. If a consumer buys it, then they know that product is going to be successful. Because they have cash to be able to do, that's what it takes. But because those old sort of traditional Western ideas of how R&D is supposed to work just haven't taken off there. So they approach it in a very different way. And I think in a lot of ways we talk a lot about, people scratch their head and go, why is China so competitive? Jim Cramer scratches his head and he doesn't understand. That's why, because they're approaching things from a very different perspective, where it's get it out on the shelf and just sell the thing. Don't worry about it being perfect. So I guess this does sort of tie back into what we were talking about a little while ago. Don't wait for perfection. Just start moving the needle.
That's interesting. I mean, I imagine that's got to be very wasteful and very
Oh,
costly.
yeah.
But then there are companies like Zara that also have a very quick, cycle time of moving fashion from design to store. Certainly not that quickly, but they are kind of known for in the industry of doing it pretty fast.
They invented fast fashion. That's their term.
Well, John, I'm going to ask Keith and Alan real quick, guys. Do you have any closing questions as we look to wrap it
Well, I
up
just
here?
have one real quick, and
I got
I'd rather,
one.
Oh, both of
and
you.
I just wanted. It's not really a question. I just wanted to interrupt Alan. That's really my role predominantly. But when does your book come out here? Because you've got at least one sold. I promise you that, and I can't wait to get it.
So silly licensing laws. So it's available in the Commonwealth right now, but it won't be available in North America until, I think I'm going to get the date wrong, March 17th. 2024. So a little bit of time. It's available for pre-order, I think, already, but definitely check it out.
It is. It is.
Appreciate that. You don't have to buy it. I'll send you a signed copy.
Send
Not
me a
that that's
signed
worth
copy,
anything.
but
Oh
I'm
my
gonna.
gosh, look at
I
that.
would love one. I really would. I'm not kidding. This has been so enlightening to me and enjoyable.
Oh.
But I'll buy one too and give it to my kids.
Yeah, absolutely.
idea.
Yeah,
Yes.
we will do the same here. But that's awesome. So St. Patrick's Day,
Of
which
course.
makes sense because greenwashing, there's a whole theme there.
My publicist,
John, you gotta capitalize on it.
my publicist is gonna love you.
Ah, look at that. Look at that.
I'm literally writing
Alan,
it down.
So,
Go
John,
for it.
my one question for you, number one, just thank you for all the time that you spent with us. I have so much admiration and respect for the kind of work that you're doing in the field and the way that you're approaching it strategically and pragmatically. I call myself a pragmatic strategist in the Army for 26 years and 10 for Raytheon. My question for you is this: you're king for a day. You snap your fingers and you make one thing happen that moves your needle in the work you're doing. What is that one thing?
I love this. I would see, as I'm thinking through this, I'm automatically thinking through the strategy of how it can't be done because there's too much nuance to it.
The
But
cascading impacts of it.
that's it, exactly right. But if it was that easy to just turn the switch, I would get rid of the oil industry right now, because they've become such a barrier to everything. And I know the cascading impacts of what do you do with people, how do you produce actual products and all that sort of stuff. Let's live in a pretend world for a second. But I think they're the biggest impediment to proper change. And once that's out of the picture and we figure out what to do with all of the stuff that they produce, because we need the oil industry, which is the sad truth. We need what they produce. But if we didn't, then I think we could be making a lot more progress a lot faster than we are.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, the oil industry isn't. I mean, it's not. Yes, it's oil, but it's plastics. It's like so many other things that we use in our everyday lives.
It's so embedded in everything that we do. That's why we just can't get rid of it.
Yeah. Well, John, thank you so much. I appreciate your time and your wisdom and your insight. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you. And like I said, we're looking forward to the book coming out. So folks who are listening to this, you can go to Amazon right now and check out the pre-order, and would highly recommend it because I'm sure it's going to have an amazing collection of wisdom in that book. You can buy now his previous book that has come out, Sustainability for the Rest of Us. So folks, if you do have the opportunity while you're at Amazon picking up, why am I promoting Amazon? While you're at your favorite book retailer, picking up Sustainability for the Rest of Us, why don't you also get the book that is going to be coming out. John, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. It was great having you. Would love to have you back anytime.
Absolutely.
So as soon as a book comes out, if you want to do this again, would love to have you back.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate it. Great conversation. Love the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, thanks everybody for checking out Disc Media, a startup story. Till next time, adios, and we will catch you again.
Adios.